It is a privilege and indeed a great pleasure to have with us today the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe to speak to us on such an interesting and timely topic. The Commissioner for Human Rights is an independent and impartial non-judicial institution established in 1999 by the Council of Europe to promote awareness of and respect for human rights in the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. Thus, the Commissioner's mandate includes assisting member states in implementing Council of Europe human rights standards, identifying shortcomings in their implementation, promoting education in human rights, advising and informing member states towards the improving of human rights structures and culture. As a non-judicial institution, the Commissioner's Office cannot act upon individual complaints, but the Commissioner can draw conclusions and take wider initiatives on the basis of reliable information regarding human rights violations suffered by individuals. Mr. Muiznieks was elected Commissioner for Human Rights in January 2012 by the Parliamentary Assembly. He is the third Commissioner, succeeding Thomas Hammarberg and Alvaro Gil Robles. He has been working in the field of human rights for the past 2 decades and has acquired extensive knowledge in the field of international human rights monitoring, training, and education. Prior to his appointment as Commissioner for Human Rights, he held prominent posts such as Director of the Advanced Social and Political Research Institute at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Latvia, Chairman of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, Latvian Minister responsible for social integration, anti-discrimination, minority rights, and civil society development, and Director of the Latvian Center for Human Rights and Ethnic Studies. He has also published extensively on human rights issues, in particular on racism, discrimination, and minority rights. I will now give the floor to the Rector of the University of Cyprus, Professor Konstantinos Christofidis, for his welcome address.
Good evening. We are honored and pleased to host at the University of Cyprus Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Nils Muiznieks. It's okay?
Close enough.
Our gathering this evening, co-organized with the Youth Board of Cyprus, gives us the opportunity to discuss, exchange ideas, and debate on the impact of economic crisis on the enjoyment of human rights. Undoubtedly, the economic crisis has wounded our society cohesion. Beginning as a global crisis of the banking systems, it has harmed to the real economy and the lives of all citizens. Most importantly, it has unveiled the numerous challenges the European Union is facing, and determining the importance of the protection of human rights, using as an excuse the necessity for austerity measures, is what actually escalates the crisis consequences. How can we ensure that human rights are protected in such periods? How do we safeguard the dignity of human life, access to education, equality, participation, and transparency in challenging eras? As individuals and active institutions, we must raise our voice demanding a safer and fairer place to live decently, work, and prosper. If the national European institutions sincerely wish to protect our society's unity and incentive for prosperity, they must protect the civil political, economic, social, and cultural rights. They have the obligation to engage individuals to actively participate in the process of promoting the protection of human rights in times of crisis, demanding the implementation of international human rights law. Commissioner, thank you once again for your presence. We have already a very interesting discussion, I hope. We are looking forward to a fruitful discussion to follow. Thank you.
The unprecedented global financial crisis constitutes a continuing and serious challenge for the protection of human rights, raising important questions. Are human rights effectively protected in the economic crisis environment? What does the economic crisis entail for human rights? Is protection of human rights taken into account in these times of crisis? How difficult and how successful is the attempt to protect human rights in times of crisis? It is widely accepted that the current economic crisis poses a serious challenge to the protection of human rights, not only in the EU, but around the world. The challenges include rising unemployment, shrinking public spending, and possibly also rising xenophobia or racism. It is also widely recognized that the rights of already disadvantaged groups, including children, women, persons with disabilities, migrants, ethnic minorities, and refugees, are particularly at risk from the crisis. In addition, the resources and capacity of redress mechanisms and human rights organizations are also affected. Where an economy is threatened with shrinking, there is a growing risk that essential programs for education, healthcare, or social assistance will suffer from budget cuts at a time when such assistance programs are mostly needed. Measures designed to promote fiscal stability could undermine protection for human rights, contrary to the Charter for Fundamental Rights of the European Union and the European Convention on Human Rights. States are under enormous pressure to embark on austerity programs, sometimes severe, in the face of rising public deficit and poor economic growth. Decisions to adopt austerity measures are always difficult and complex, and this may lead many states to take decisions with sometimes painful effects, especially when these austerity measures are taken in a recession. The obligations of states lie primarily in the choices they make in response to the economic crisis and the merits of these choices with regard to their impact on the protection of human rights. States need to frame and evaluate their responses to the economic crisis in line with their obligations under human rights law and principles. The Commissioner's intervention this evening discusses such pertinent issues relating to the economic crisis in Europe and makes recommendations for governments to help them better to align their economic recovery policies with their international obligations to ensure the protection of human rights within their borders. Mr. Muiznieks, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You already gave my lecture, so I'll be very short. Dear Rector, professors, students, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for coming. I understand you should all be studying because you have exams. So I'm glad to see so many of you here. Before jumping into the topic of austerity and human rights, let me briefly explain what my work entails. You gave a brief summary, but just so you understand what it is that I do and how I do it, and what I'm doing in Cyprus. You mentioned that my mandate says that I should be an independent, impartial, non-judicial institution. What does this mean? Independent means I'm not to take instructions from anybody, either within the Council of Europe or from any country. My independence is enshrined in my 6-year mandate, which is non-renewable. The creators of my post were very wise. They said you could only have one mandate for 6 years, which is very good. Otherwise, I would have to start lobbying to be re-elected halfway through my mandate, and I couldn't speak as freely. I have my own team, my own budget. I have a team of 25, a budget of 3 million euros or so. And it cannot be held hostage by any one state, as the budget of the OSCE can. Impartial means I should treat all states equally. And the common standard I'm supposed to hold them to is the European Convention on Human Rights. This is sometimes complicated because I have small states like Monaco and San Marino. I have big states like Russia and Turkey. I have wealthy states, I have poor states, and I have everything in between. But I'm supposed to hold them to the same standard. And I cannot spend all of my time in one area of the Council of Europe. I must visit all 47 member states. So, which means I travel nonstop, which means I live in the airport at Frankfurt, basically. This is my second home. Non-judicial means I cannot force a country to do anything. I can shame them, I can raise awareness, I can share best practices with them, I can try to convince them, I can give them bad press, and sometimes it works, and other times it doesn't. It depends on the context, depends on whether or not I have worked well, whether or not I have found allies at the national level, whether that ally be a minister, a political party, a deputy or a group of deputies in the parliament, an ombudsman, or whether I'm just providing good ammunition to civil society organizations to continue the work after I leave. The core of my work is country visits. We try to do about 10 visits a year with reports, although I visit up to 24 countries in a year. This was, I think, my record for last year was 24 countries, but 10 visits with reports. What does a country visit entail? I identify a country, I inform them I'm coming. I would like to meet with these people. I would like to go to these sites of human rights interest. And mostly human rights sites of interest are Roma settlements, refugee detention facilities, migrant squats, psychiatric hospitals, police stations, prisons, all the nastiest places in Europe that you can imagine. And believe me, every European country has nasty places. Before going, we collect a lot of information. I meet first with NGOs to find out what they've been trying to tell the government. I meet with ministers, presidents, prime ministers, princes, ombudsmen, and then we write a report. And then, as I said, and then the real work starts to try to promote what we are selling. That requires a lot of media work. It requires coming back. So I will undoubtedly be back to Cyprus after this visit during your chairmanship of the Council of Europe. I don't know if you know this, but Cyprus will have the rotating chairmanship of the Council of Europe as of next year for 6 months. So it's kind of a traveling roadshow, and you will be running it. So I will definitely be back for an event during your chairmanship. Now, one of the issues I've looked at in a number of different countries, which kind of framed the beginning of my mandate when I began in April 2012, was austerity and the economic crisis, and what it entails for human rights. And it entails a lot. I experienced austerity firsthand in Latvia. I don't know if you know, but Latvia's GDP dropped by 25% in 2 years, in 2008 and 2009. So we saw quite a bit of austerity in Latvia as well. It's been the focus of a number of country visits I've carried out to Portugal, to Spain, to Estonia. It's been the context, very important context in country visits to Italy, to Greece, and to Ireland. And it's one of the areas of focus for this visit to Cyprus. We are focusing on the impact of austerity on women, on children, and on older persons. And we're also looking at migration and asylum issues. Migration and asylum issues, by the way, have displaced austerity as being the #1 topic in Europe. For a while it was Ukraine, but now it's migration and asylum absolutely everywhere. But austerity remains a concern not only here, but in many other countries, and I have a feeling that we have not seen the end of austerity and economic crises, and I have a feeling that we will see other countries in trouble. I will not make any detailed remarks about Cyprus. That's too soon. I've been here for 2 days. I'm still gathering information. You'll be able to read my conclusions about Cyprus in a report, which will be published probably in about 3 months with recommendations. But for now, let me share some thoughts on austerity and human rights based on my other work in the Council of Europe, in other countries, in my 3.5 years of experience in my job to date. I would submit that the economic crisis, the long economic crisis, threatens 6 decades of social solidarity and human rights protection in the Council of Europe member states. Many governments have implemented austerity measures as emergency measures, kind of avoiding the standard democratic procedures, sidestepping regular channels of participation and consultation with their publics, oftentimes with their parliaments. Moreover, European and international institutions have assumed a central role in enforcing austerity, which leads to the question, where are the citizens of Europe in the process? Are we to take whatever the European Union, the IMF, and the World Bank throw at us? Austerity is not only a context, it also affects a range of human rights, both economic and social rights, as well as civil and political rights. It has hit, as you mentioned, vulnerable groups harder in most contexts, and it has weakened human rights protection systems overall. Weakened judiciaries, weakened human rights, national human rights structures, and weakened kind of the NGO scene in many countries undergoing austerity. Let me start by briefly looking at a few of the rights and how they've been affected in different contexts. Let me start with economic and social rights, and particularly the right to work, which is enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, as well as the European Social Charter. We have seen within the European Union an unemployment rate right now, which is at 9.3%. This was for September of 2015. This is down from 10.1% a little over a year ago, so slight improvement there. But if you look across Europe, you see huge differences. In Greece, it's over 25%. In Spain, it's 21.6% in September of this year. And we've seen workers' rights be eroded in a number of different contexts, including the right to collective bargaining and to a safe and healthy working environment. A lot of corners being cut in many places about labor inspections, about health and safety standards, and this is leading to increased risk for workers. And when economic conditions are bad, demand for cheap labor goes up, and this increases the risks of exploitation of workers. So we are hearing stories and seeing the risk of the reemergence of child labor in a number of different contexts, a scourge which we thought had been successfully combated in many different contexts, of trafficking in human beings. Heard a lot about trafficking in human beings in Cyprus, by the way, as well as mistreatment of migrant workers. And what makes it worse is oftentimes the cuts that we see in public expenditures have really weakened labor inspections and child protection services, which do the work of going out and actually finding the people who are being exploited. The second big right to be affected is the right to an adequate standard of living. We've seen growing poverty in many European countries. In 2013, 122 million people in the EU, or almost a quarter of the population in the EU, was considered to be at risk of poverty and social exclusion. More than 1/3 of the population are at risk in countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Latvia, and Hungary. More than 1/3. These are huge numbers in certain countries. The next right, the right to social security and social protection, has also suffered in countries undergoing austerity. As the crisis has deepened, demand for protection has increased, but revenue to sustain these systems has decreased, which has put huge pressure on these systems, and they've been cut sometimes in ways that disproportionately have affected the most vulnerable. We've seen pension reforms, which have often increased the vulnerability of certain categories of people and the risk of growing poverty among older people. Saw a lot of this in Portugal, trying to understand how serious it is here. The right to education. I understood the University of Cyprus has done very well in the crisis. That's what your rector told me. So the right to education in the University of Cyprus has not been affected, but this is not the case in very many other educational contexts in the Council of Europe space. Spain cut its education budget by 21% from 2011 to 2012. Estonia cut its budget by more than 10%. This has affected the quality of education, the accessibility of education, and the affordability of education in these two countries, but in many others as well. The risk, of course, is at early ages that you will have more and more school dropouts with long-term effects, which will be with these young people as they grow up, as they get older, and it will affect their life chances, it will affect their health, and it will affect their mental health as well. And there are other social and economic rights which have been affected as well. But let me turn to civil and political rights. And most people think, well, the crisis doesn't have a whole lot to do with civil and political rights. I would disagree, and I think what we have seen is that the crisis brought out the interdependence of many different human rights. For example, if you are evicted from your house, you have no right to privacy. Conditions of detention in many prisons and other places have deteriorated in conditions of austerity because there are fewer guards and people are spending more and more time locked up in cells. But there are other rights which have been affected as well. The right to participate in public affairs and governance transparency has suffered in many different contexts. Governments have often felt the need to move very quickly to try to get their finances in order. They've avoided the regular procedures for consultation, for social dialogue, for participation, and taken decisions very often overnight without the relevant consultations. The executive, in many contexts, has been given a whole lot of power and authority, basically throwing out the standard checks and balances and the role of Parliament in the interest of saving time and making quick decisions. Austerity has threatened access to justice in many contexts. Most commonly, what we have seen is cuts in legal aid budgets so that poor people cannot afford a lawyer and they are not given a free lawyer to take their cases to court, and increases in court fees. In several different contexts I ran into in Estonia and in Spain, arguments that, oh, the courts have to pay more for themselves in these difficult times. So we have put up court fees, or planning to put up court fees, which makes justice less accessible, especially to people with few means. In Estonia, state fees for civil and certain administrative proceedings were increased by a factor, between a factor of 2 and a factor of 5 in 2009. And then after this was challenged in the courts, I don't know where they got the money for the challenge, it was challenged in the courts and then was repealed. But it made justice pretty inaccessible for a little while there. In several member states, we've seen ombudsmen's offices, national human rights structures, which are key for vulnerable groups to access their rights. We've seen these gutted, we've seen their budgets slashed, we've seen regional offices closed in some contexts, and we've seen mergers of some bodies, making them much less accessible to their usual beneficiaries. In other contexts, we've seen freedom of expression and freedom of assembly curtailed in the context of austerity. In Latvia, I remember very distinctly, we had one riot, one small riot in the context of austerity in 2009. For months after that, the police would not allow a single demonstration to take place in the center of town. They were afraid it would get out of hand, so they curtailed freedom of assembly in that context. In Spain, Greece, and Portugal, there are a lot of concerns about excessive use of force against demonstrators, demonstrators against austerity, and Spain has moved after the initial spurt of protests against austerity measures to put in various restrictions in place on freedom of assembly. So I would link it to that as well. Some groups, as you mentioned in your introduction, have been hit disproportionately hard by austerity and by budget cuts and by these measures. And this, of course, raises the issue of equality and non-discrimination, which is a right that transects both civil and political rights and social and economic rights. I already mentioned child poverty, but also youth unemployment, which is huge in many different countries. And this will have long-term effects, which I think we cannot really predict yet. Not only on the well-being and life chances of young people who are unemployed now, but on their pensions, on their commitment to Europe. Why should a young person who's played the game, been through it, gotten a good education, taken out student loans, and can't get a job, why should this young person really believe in the European idea and social solidarity? So I have a feeling we're going to be paying the price for youth unemployment and child poverty for many, many years, and not only at the national level, but at the European level. People with disabilities have been affected disproportionately in a number of different contexts. Not only are there unemployment rates of persons with disabilities much, much higher than those of others, but we've seen cuts to many of the supports that make their lives basically much easier to live. Supports for sign language interpreters, supports, financial supports of various kinds. So persons with disabilities, I think in every context, needs special protection. Women have been affected disproportionately in certain contexts. I'm trying to ascertain whether that's a case here, but I'm told that you have very bad data. And we're trying to get good data on how the crisis has affected women. But it's clear that women are affected more by public sector cuts in the public sector, because women tend to be employed more in the public sector than in the private sector. That cuts in childcare, parental and child benefits hit women disproportionately. And at the same time, a larger burden of the care is placed on women's shoulders and on men's shoulders, because women tend to be the primary carers of persons with disabilities, of children, of older persons. So at the same time they're getting squeezed out of the labor market, a greater burden is being put on them because the cuts for the various people that are dependent upon them are increasing. Also, in many different contexts, especially in countries undergoing economic crisis, domestic violence tends to increase. At the same time, support for shelters tends to decrease. This is something we're trying to ascertain here as well. I understand you have one shelter for battered women for the whole of the island, which seems to me a little bit too little. Migrants are have also been hit harder in a number of different contexts. In Greece, we did a lot of work on racism and on Golden Dawn, on collusion between the police and Golden Dawn. And it was clear that you had racism and xenophobia in Greece before the onset of the economic crisis. It was not invented during the crisis. But it's also clear that the crisis amplified these tendencies in society and gave fuel to them. How to address these problems, these challenges I've mentioned? What is the role of human rights standards, of human rights mechanisms? I think the key thing is to consider human rights to not be a luxury, but an integral part of any economic recovery. If we don't integrate human rights into our plans to rebuild after the crisis, we'll be paying the price for a long time. There's growing evidence, even among that strange breed of scientist called the economist, that economic development is more sustainable if human rights are protected. And especially there's more and more evidence that inequality is bad for economic growth. The OECD, the IMF, and others have been putting out research in recent years saying that, hey, this old line of neoliberalism doesn't hold true, that inequality is bad for growth. In December of 2013, we published an issue paper, which many of you have in front of you, on safeguarding human rights in times of crisis. This grew out of the fact that in my first country visit to Portugal, I was struggling to have a conceptual framework for addressing this issue. The Portuguese were asking me for best practices, and I kept on having to say, I'll get back to you. I'll get back to you very soon. So we organized a bunch of consultations with experts, with equality bodies throughout Europe, and we did a series of seminars and before we put this out. And I'm quite proud of it. I think it holds a stand. I think it holds has held up well over time, over the last couple of years. What do we suggest in this issue paper? That governments should, first of all, focus on reducing youth unemployment and long-term unemployment while upholding social protection floors. There should be a floor of social protection, of basic income and health services under which nobody should fall. Nobody should end up on the streets with no health care whatsoever. Government should carry out human rights and equality impact assessments of their budgets. This is a topic I'm going to discuss with your Minister of Finance tomorrow. To involve academics, human rights experts, human rights structures in analyzing budgets, to try to assess whether they will affect certain groups more than others and how to mitigate the negative impact on certain groups. There's a lot of expertise in Europe on this now. There's also a need to institutionalize transparency and accountability of governments throughout the policy cycle. So in other words, they should provide as much information and data on budgets, on taxes, on fiscal policy, on financial policy to enable monitoring. Monitoring by civil society, monitoring by human rights structures and ombudsmen, and monitoring by parliaments as well. Positive measures in favor of disadvantaged groups should be considered, especially people with disabilities, Roma, women. These are often needed to address disproportionate impacts or compound effects of previous discrimination. The importance of international instruments on social rights should be stressed in the context of crisis. And in the Council of Europe, we have the European Social Charter. It's not as strong a mechanism as a court, but it is the premier European social and economic rights standard. In other words, all member states should ratify it, and it also has a collective complaints mechanism whereby NGOs can complain about violations of social rights. Cyprus has ratified. It's also accepted the collective complaints procedure, but until now there's only been one collective complaint from Cyprus. I would encourage Cypriot civil society to be more active, to use this instrument. It is a tool that you can use to defend your social and economic rights. And governments do not ignore this completely. They do not always follow the decisions completely, but it is a useful tool for advocacy and for holding the government to account and saying, these are your obligations, you signed up to them, live up to them. National human rights structures, ombudsman, equality bodies, have huge potential to mitigate the impact, the negative impact of austerity on different vulnerable groups. Very often they know best who is suffering most because this is their job, if they're doing their job well. In Portugal, for example, the ombudsman has 3 different hotlines, one for a person with disabilities, another for children, and another, if I remember correctly, for older persons. So he knows very well what the situation of these groups is, and he can bring this into the policy debate and say, listen, this measure that you have adopted is hitting this group really hard. You should consider changing it. In the end, I think there's a need to reinvigorate the European social model, which has been kind of undermined very seriously in different places. And I think that human rights standards need to be integrated into the work not only of national governments, but also of international lenders and the European Union. Too often we see them imposing conditions that afterwards are challenged in courts, challenged in international tribunals, and then the governments have to change what the international lenders imposed upon them and go back to their human rights standards. I say that this should be done from the outset to avoid confusion. And I think we owe it to ourselves and to our children and the next generation not only to have prosperous societies, but to have ones that respect and protect human rights as well. I'll stop there now and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Mr. Muiznieks, thank you very much for a very enlightening lecture. And now we have some time, some 15 minutes to take some questions. So the Commissioner is ready to answer 2 questions.
Okay. Can I ask if it's a fair conclusion to say that, to use a term that is being mainly used in finances, that Europe has been living in a bubble as far as human rights? Because we've seen, as you described, and having felt the impact in Cyprus also, that human rights have easily gone down the drain because of the austerity measures, economic policies that were enforced. And I'm wondering if that's a fair conclusion, that we had this bubble, and how do you see that we can take lessons from what we still going through so that it's not repeated in the future?
I think it will be better if the Commissioner replies to 2 or 3 questions together. So, yes, you have the floor.
It's quite relevant. I would ask, seeing the crisis now, we see that politics always affects human rights. We were not born with human rights. We created human rights as human beings. However, when it comes to policies in Europe, we see that human rights reached a level where politicians now are taking them back in a way that, okay, economy is more important than human rights, social security of the state is more important than human rights, and we see a lot of things like freedom of speech being taken away, freedom of movement being taken away, for something better, as politicians call it, which is security of the state or security of the public. Is that a true security or a true way to protect the people by taking their human rights away? Thank you.
And is there any other question? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. My question is about the right to conscientious objection. And firstly, what is your impression about this particular right in the Council of Europe? And in particular, in the case of Cyprus, if you plan to explore this issue in detail, because as far as I'm concerned, there is a huge lack of awareness of the citizens about this right. And this happens in a country which has a compulsory military service of 24 months. And the alternative service is of a punitive character, which is something which was criticized by many international organizations. So yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to address those. Have we thrown all human rights out the window? I don't think so, not yet. I think that in some contexts, actually, I've seen people use a crisis as an opportunity to do reforms that they've been putting off for a long time. For example, in both Italy and Portugal, I had ministers of justice tell me, we cannot afford our lousy judiciaries anymore. They're driving away investment. We've calculated how much it costs to have an inefficient judiciary. You know what the average time for a civil case in Italy is? 8 years. So it's a very, and they say, we cannot afford this anymore. So we have to carry out reforms to deal with it. So, and I see the same thing, that people are looking at waste in a new way. How much money has the European Union spent on Roma integration projects throughout Europe? Incredible amounts of money. Where is the result? And I know that Commissioner Hahn, who's in charge of enlargement and neighboring countries, commissioned an independent study to examine the impact of EU money on Roma integration in the Western Balkans and in other places outside the EU. And I've been urging them to do the same thing within the EU. This is a time when we can no longer afford the waste. We never could afford it, but now is the time to do away with the waste that has existed in different contexts. So I think occasionally there are positive byproducts of the crisis as well. It allows thinking outside the box. You were talking about other concerns trumping human rights. And during the crisis, during the economic crisis in different contexts, we didn't see it so much, kind of a willful throwing of human rights out the window. It was more collateral damage in trying to fix the finances. But where I do see a willful destruction of human rights is in the struggle against terrorism. We saw in Europe over the last 10, 12 years, 2 different episodes which suggests that democratic oversight of security services doesn't work at all. The first was the whole kind of sordid story of extraordinary rendition, the secret prisons in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, the cooperation of up to 25 countries, maybe more, with the CIA in torture, in arbitrary detention, in abductions of people, and almost nobody was held to account for this. Where were the people overseeing the security services? Where were the parliamentary committees, the ombudsman, everybody who was supposed to make sure that human rights were being observed? The second episode was Mr. Snowden's revelations of mass surveillance. Where were the whistleblowers? Where were the people overseeing the security services? And now, immediately after Snowden's revelations, we saw outrage, we saw attempts to the creation of certain parliamentary committees in Germany and elsewhere. But immediately after the attacks in France, first against Charlie Hebdo and others in Paris, but now, just recently in November, we see a complete overreaction, a state of emergency in France with the arbitrary abduction, house arrest of hundreds of people. I just received today letters from Greenpeace. They were confined to house arrest during the climate conference in Paris. Why? What does this have to do with terrorism and combating terrorism? We see a rush to change constitutions in France, in Finland, so to give more powers to the president or to the Secret Service. Why change your constitution in a period of crisis? This is the worst idea ever. And I have no problem in giving the security services additional money, additional technology, additional powers, as long as we beef up democratic oversight of security services, as long as we have robust, intrusive, law-based monitoring of what security services are doing. So if you give more money to your security services, you should give more money to your oversight bodies to make sure that they know what's going on, they understand the technology, and they see it. We put out an issue paper on democratic oversight as well. It's on our website if you're interested in that. Regarding conscientious objection, a couple of years ago, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in a case against Armenia, if I'm not mistaken, that conscientious objection falls under freedom of religion under the European Convention. And Armenia was forced to change its law, release all persons who were put in prison for conscientious objection, and to create a genuinely civil alternative service which was non-punitive in length. And this falls under freedom of religion under the European Convention. So if there are people who are still being, who are faced with a punitive, not wholly civilian alternative service because and are suffering because of their belief, they can take a case to the European Court of Human Rights and point to this case from Armenia. Every country in Europe should have genuinely civil alternative service which is non-punitive in length.
Okay. And, I think there is time for another round of questions. Yes? Yes.
He's not a student, eh?
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking presentation. I note your statement that human rights are not a luxury, and I think that's quite pertinent. I turn now to the point of human rights standards in international lenders, and I find that very interesting. I do share the feeling that the human rights spring is over, And I think we're getting into a human rights winter. And I think that is something that has been accelerated by the economic crisis. Now, you expressed the view that there should be some testing of the standards used by the international lenders. And let me throw this back at you and ask you whether you're interested in setting up a compatibility test to be imposed on agreements that are given to people and have some sort of control prior to the event, as opposed to waiting for the agreement to be signed and then all these poor people going hiring expensive lawyers to find justice at the end of the day. And if they do go to Strasbourg and get a judgment, sometimes these judgments are not executed by the member states. So the question is, do you think of setting up a blueprint, as you mentioned in Portugal, saying you'd get back to us on it, as to whether there is this compatibility because of this economic crisis that we're facing? Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
Thanks for the answer on the right to conscientious objection. If I could kindly ask again if you plan to explore the issue in the Cypriot context.
And I think we can have one more question. Yes, please.
Mr. Commissioner, I understand that data collection is a very important part of your job in order for you to make the safest possible conclusions. And I also understand for various reasons that sometimes this is a very difficult part of your job. Maybe sometimes governments are afraid to reveal the data they already have in order to safeguard their public image. And at other times, I understand that certain governments are not as competent as they should have been in collecting data. So is there any kind of pressure through your position to apply, either through the Council of Europe or the European Union, in order to safeguard the best possible collection of data? Thank you very much.
Okay. The human rights spring is over. Is winter coming? No, I think we're in the autumn right now. We're not in. We're not yet in winter, but we might reverse time. A compatibility test for international bailout programs. I don't think my office would be capable of doing this, but I think what's interesting is that the EU should be doing this anyway. Everything they do is supposed to be governed by the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So they should be analyzing, whenever they engage in such programs, whether it raises risks or problems with regard to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. They should do human rights fundamental, or in their language, fundamental rights impact assessments. And the European Central Bank should as well. I think that one agency which could do a lot in this regard is a fundamental rights agency in Vienna, the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. This is their job, to collect data and do analysis and provide policy input to the Commission and other EU bodies on fundamental rights issues. We can help. In our issue paper, we have compiled a lot of best practices, and we continue to do this in my office. We know who is doing good work across Europe on this, which human rights structures, which academic departments, in which countries, and we can share that information. It's not a secret. And anybody who wants to engage in this, we can provide our input in it. But I think the EU should be doing it itself, and we should push the EU to do it itself. Regarding conscientious objection in the Cypriot context, it was not on my agenda for this visit, but that doesn't exclude me from raising it with the authorities, either in my discussions with them in a subsequent letter or in a subsequent visit. If you have information on this or any other human rights issue that you think should be on our plate, please send it to us, and I can't promise we'll raise it, but if we gather enough information and we think it's something that needs to be raised, we'll raise it. Data is a problem, but it's pretty hard to hide a serious human rights problem because we have smart, tough NGOs out there gathering information. We have smart, tough investigative journalists gathering information. There's Eurostat, there are Eurobarometers. They're the Fundamental Rights Agency's surveys on various issues, for example, on domestic violence, on various other issues. They've done good surveys throughout the EU. For non-EU members, data sometimes is more problematic. The EU, in terms of data, is not bad because there's been a lot of pressure from the Commission, and especially those countries that are in the EU and in the OECD. They have very good data. It's the non-EU countries which have much less data. But there the situation is improving as well. But you're right. And very often, one of our recommendations is, collect disaggregated data by age, ethnicity, religion, so on. Of course, based on self-identification, of course, on a voluntary basis, of course, with all the relevant caveats about data protection. What kind of pressure can I put on a country? Well, my tools are mostly words. My tools are also, the one legal tool I have is I can intervene before the European Court of Human Rights as a third party. And I've done this more and more. I just intervened on a couple of cases regarding migration, pushbacks from Spain. We're looking right now at a case against Austria with regard to Dublin returns to Hungary, but a whole slew of other cases. So that's the one legal. But it'd be pretty hard to bring a country to the European Court of Human Rights for having bad data. I don't think that's enshrined in the convention, but it certainly makes human rights work much, much easier. But there are ways to get around it. For example, NGO data. If the government says, "Oh, that's not believable," I say, "Okay, show me your data." Or data from the ombudsman. Ombudsmen receive a lot of complaints. If they're doing their job right, they get a lot of information. I learned that your ombudsman has a lot of information and reports and studies which are not on her website. So I said, "Oh, very good. Please give us all this information, and we will use it and incorporate it." So we're always trying to have our antenna out looking for information and data, because without data, it's very hard to make this case. But thank you for all your questions. Oh, I see there's one more question. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Do you think?
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
I can go on all night.
If there is any other question, perhaps we can take. Yes, please.
As you're here, and in Cyprus, you know that we passed the civil union law, political union as it's called. I've been reading the news, and I saw that European Union has set some guidelines for integration of LGBT people within the community and against the discrimination of LGBTQ+ community, etc. I would like to ask you, as Commissioner of Human Rights, do you think that the lives of LGBT people are a matter of Europe or not? Because European Union said marriage or civil union, it's not upon the Commission or the European Parliament to decide, it's upon member states. However, the discrimination being neglected, let's say, because as you can see in the law of Cyprus, hate speech and discrimination between other types of people and LGBT people is being split in two different laws. So by that I would say that we are in a way separating them in law, which means we're separating within the communities. But is it time for us to put them and actually apply the non-discrimination to all types of people and all groups of people? Is it time to create a European level and a European strategy on this topic and stop seeing youngsters and children killing themselves because they're different as everybody of us in this room only is? Thank you.
And any other question, please? Final one. Oh, yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation, Commissioner. A word of caution on data. Recently, a European study found that the most satisfied citizens of Europe regarding public transport were the Cypriots. Of course, there is no public transport in Cyprus, and you can ask the students. You can ask the students here how many of them have ever used or are using public transport. But it relates to another more serious question, perhaps. You mentioned that we see an accentuation of xenophobia and racism as a result of the crisis, and that's quite right. And you mentioned Greece as an example, and I guess the evidence for that is the rise of Golden Dawn. And that has been as a result of the economic crisis. But at the same time, and I would value your thoughts on this, we have seen an outpouring of community solidarity, especially on the islands, with the refugees that are arriving there. So the two seem to be going in opposite directions. With regard to the effects of crisis on human rights, you mentioned the security, the enhancement of security powers and so on, which is quite right. And in the classic aspect of human rights, the ones that you described, you are quite right. But there is also the one that relates to more the economic aspects, in the sense that, for example, in Cyprus, the need to investigate efficiently and effectively the going-ons that caused the economic crisis have made it more likely and more acceptable to increase those powers to the security services. For example, a recent law enabling the security forces to have access to private mails, emails, SMS, and so on. And I note very much your point that this is okay as long as you enhance the democratic oversight on it as well. And I take it that that should precede, that democratic oversight enhancement should precede the enhancement of the security, of enhancing the powers of the security forces. I don't think we have seen this in Cyprus, and maybe when you go to the parliament, you can ask your colleagues there how they are viewing that. And my final point is that this is a very opportune event. Tomorrow is World Human Rights Day. But today is, I just learned from the Vice Rector that today is also World Day Against Corruption. And there is another event taking place, another place. And sorry?
It's also St. Anna today. It's a happy day, you know.
Okay. Have you had any ideas about how these two have been affected by the crisis, especially in a more institutionalized, corrupt environment? Thank you.
Commissioner, you have the floor for this last round of questions.
Thank you. On LGBTI rights, I add the I, intersex persons, which are not very well known. It used to be called, in some contexts, hermaphrodites, persons who don't fit neatly into either the male or female category. We put out an issue paper on that as well. You were talking a lot about the EU. I don't represent the EU, so I can't really speak too much to the EU. I can talk about the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe, recently there was a case in the European Court of Human Rights on civil unions. The case was from Italy, and it basically found Italy in violation for not having legislation to legalize civil unions. This was a groundbreaking case, and what does that mean? On many of these issues, which the court considers to be linked in some way to tradition, culture, religion, it allows a great leeway to member states. It says, we're not best placed to judge on this. There's a large margin of appreciation here. We think you're better placed to decide. What happened recently, though, is that more than half of all member states in the Council of Europe space have adopted civil partnership legislation in one form or another. And when that happens, when more than half of all member states do something, then the court begins to say, there's an emerging European consensus, and your margin of maneuver is decreasing. So it just did that regarding civil unions. So I have a feeling that we're going to see a lot of changes, a lot of challenges in those countries that don't have such legislation. The court's case law is also evolving on hate speech. Until a couple of years ago, hate speech by the court was considered only to concern hate speech on the grounds of race, ethnicity, religion. But a couple of years ago, it included hate speech on the grounds of sexual orientation as well. So it is expanding its jurisprudence and understanding of these things as jurisprudence in national context evolves. I think it'd be great if there were not only an EU strategy, but a Council of Europe strategy. The problem in the Council of Europe is that we were making good progress on LGBTI rights until a couple of years ago. That's because those who were against LGBTI rights were quiet and silent, and things will move forward. In the last couple of years, they've begun to speak up very loudly and to protest, and we've had very little progress in the last couple of years. But there is the jurisprudence of the court is evolving pretty rapidly. The monitoring of the ECRI, which I used to chair, until 2-3 years ago, it didn't include hate crimes or hate speech based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Now it does. So things are moving in the Council of Europe, but I think a Europe-wide strategy on these issues would be very good. It would push along the reluctant countries, the countries that are resisting and even backsliding. The impact of austerity, racism on the one hand, solidarity on the other. I completely agree with you, and recently I got very tired of kind of the discourse of panic about migration, saying, oh, we can't cope, there's no way we can cope, our poor pensioners, they're going to starve while we're helping the new migrants. I got very tired of that, and I also didn't think it reflected very well sentiments in society, in many societies, even societies with very nasty governments on migration issues. So what we did is we went through a process of identifying civil society initiatives for solidarity with migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, and did a whole series on Facebook and Twitter called Rays of Hope, running up to the Valletta summit on these issues, because I thought I wanted to confront states that said, oh no, our people would never accept this. I said, listen, you have good people who are doing all kinds of actions in favor of solidarity. I think maybe I wasn't sufficiently clear when I talked about surveillance and security services. I think that unfettered access to private communications is not in line with human rights. I think that untargeted mass surveillance is highly problematic from a human rights perspective. There are a number of cases pending at the court now. I think it'll be quite interesting to see this. I think the shift from targeted surveillance to surveillance on somebody with a court order for a limited period of time in which the data should be destroyed after a certain point of time based on a reasonable suspicion that that person is or is going to be engaged in crime, that is one thing. But what we're seeing now is something completely else. We're seeing mass surveillance, new technologies which are very intrusive, and this affects not only the right to privacy, it affects freedom of the media. Who is protesting French surveillance laws right now in the European Court of Human Rights? The French Association of Journalists, because no source is confidential anymore if the security services see everything. That means that journalists, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, others cannot do their work. The same thing holds true with lawyer-client confidentiality. You can throw that out the window if the Secret Services have access to everything as well. So it affects a whole range of different rights. And I'm sorry if I wasn't sufficiently clear, but I'm quite worried about, even with strong safeguards, the technologies now are so advanced, IMSI catchers in France, where they catch the communications not only of the person that you suspect of doing something, but of everybody in the vicinity. They're very intrusive technologies we have right now, and I think that most of us are only learning about these technologies now. Corruption and human rights, the Council of Europe has its own monitoring body on this called Greco. There's also Moneyval, which does money laundering. I think on the one hand, you know, just like many state institutions, anti-corruption bodies have been weakened through budget cuts and so on, and this is no longer the priority it was in some places. On the other hand, I think that now, given the influence of banks and of laundered money in the crisis, and now laundered money and in terrorism, that there is much less tolerance for shady banking practices. And I say this as a Latvian who has seen plenty of shady banking practices. I won't say anything about the Cypriot banking system. I think it's perfect. I think I'll stop on that.
Mr. Muiznieks, thank you very much for your intervention this evening. We are looking forward to reading your report on Cyprus, which hopefully will include some of the issues which were raised in the discussion tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.